Hi everyone. According to one popular theory, Atlantis can be identified with the Eye of the Sahara in Mauretania. Now, according to some proponents of this theory, one of the pieces of evidence for this is the fact that apparently the king of Mauretania in legend, in Greek myth, was Atlas. And that matches the fact that the king of Atlantis, in the legend of Atlantis, was supposedly King Atlas. So that seems like a great match. We've got Atlantis and we've got Mauretania, both of them supposedly ruled by a King Atlas. But does this really check out? Well, if you watched my previous video about the topic of Atlantis, my previous video where I looked into the Eye of the Sahara, you may have already realized why this doesn't work. So in that previous video, I looked at the fact that supposedly ancient maps place Atlantis in this location. There are maps which refer to the Atlantes in northwest Africa. The problem though is that the reference to Atlantes is actually a reference to a people, not a place. The Atlantes were the people who lived near the Atlas Mountains. That's why they're called the Atlantes. It's not a reference to Atlantis, it's a reference to Atlas, as in the Atlas Mountains. Now, as I explained in that previous video, there are a number of problems with this. For one thing, they're not actually close to the Eye of the Sahara. Secondly, and this is a very important point, Atlas was not associated with Northwest Africa that early in Greek tradition. It wasn't until about, let's say, well, about the 6th century BCE when he started to be associated with that area, which means that the Atlas Mountains weren't called the Atlas Mountains before then, which means the people there were not the Atlantes before then, which means this whole area has no association with Atlas long before the time of Solon. So the era in which the Atlantis legend supposedly came from. That's the reason why the reference in these ancient maps to the Atlantes in that area can't have anything to do with Atlantis. Now, as I said earlier in the video, you might have already worked out why that means that the reference to King Atlas of Mauretania can't have anything to do with King Atlas of Atlantis. So Atlas, the king of Mauretania, is the same as the Titan Atlas, who supposedly was supporting the sky. He, in later legend, evolved into a human king in the minds of people who are writing about him. He was originally a Titan. He was kind of a primordial god, as it were, who had the role of holding up the sky. And then in tradition, he evolved into being a human king who was just figuratively described as holding up the sky. That's how they rationalized it. But the point is, it's the same figure. Atlas, the king of Mauretania, is Atlas, the Titan who held up the sky. Now, when we look at the earliest traces of Atlas in Greek tradition, we find that he was actually placed on the western coast of Greece, as in right there, just off the coast, not in the distant west. He was associated with the land of the Hesperides, who are traditionally viewed as living in the region of Spain, or even further beyond Spain. But the problem is that this comes from late tradition, whereas when we look at the earliest traces of traditions about the Hesperides, about Atlas, about the route in the Odyssey, about the area in which the god Helios had his sacred cattle, it all indicates that the Greeks originally believed that this all occurred around Western Greece. Even the Encyclopedia Britannica contains the point that the Greeks appear to have originally envisioned Atlas as being stationed just beyond the western horizon, not in the distant west. And we see traces of this tradition preserved in later but still relatively early records. So for example, one fairly early writer called Hecataeus in the 6th century BCE, he explained that the territory of Erythea, which was where Helios supposedly had his sacred cattle, was the region of Ambracia and Amphilochi, which is the region of mainland Greece, basically just next to Lefkada. And this territory, Erythea, was part of the territory of the Hesperides, and Hesiod tells us that Atlas was standing at the borders of the earth before the clear-voiced Hesperides. So when we look at this early evidence, it's very clear that Atlas was not originally associated with the far west, as far west as northwest Africa. That's later tradition. He was originally associated with the immediate border of Greece itself, not the distant west. So there's no basis from early tradition to associate Atlas with anywhere even remotely near the Eye of the Sahara. So we can actually see how this tradition evolved. We can see how Atlas was originally placed just west of Greece, and then he was pushed further as the Greeks became more familiar with the Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean. He was pushed further west and eventually became fixed in northwest Africa, and then tradition continued to evolve and he became viewed as once being a human king of that area. Hence, the legend of Atlas, the king of Mauretania, was finally developed. So we can see that this legend of Atlas, the king of Mauretania, is not some tradition that's been preserved from many thousands of years ago. It has nothing to do with any potential Atlantis in that area. We can't use this to support the Eye of the Sahara theory. It relies on very late tradition. But of course, that's not the only piece of evidence that's used in support of the theory that the Eye of the Sahara was Atlantis. So in a future video, or future videos actually, we'll take a look at all these other pieces of evidence as well. For now though, if you'd like to see the fourth part of my investigation into the historical King Arthur and how he may be identified as the historical Athro son of Mairig, then come back next time for my next video.